I'm going to talk here about local space astrology, and I'm going to relate to you a powerful new way of coming to know yourself through astrology. And it involves another kind of chart, or another kind of map of our birth moment. In this case, it's a map of the actual space surrounding the birthplace on all sides. In this form of what we could call topocentric astrology, I call the astrology of local space. And first I should tell you how I got onto this, how I happened onto this fascinating approach to astrology. At the time, I was involved in an attempt at understanding the many different house systems that astrologers use, and trying to decide which of all of them, might be best for my own purposes. For several years before that, I had just kind of stopped using house systems. I didn't use any house system at all. Instead, I just used the four basic angles of the chart, the ascendant, the descendant, midheaven, and the IC. And I used these in kind of a protest, or maybe it was just a disgust at the lack of agreement among astrologers concerning systems of house division. It seemed rather strange to me that there were so many competing systems of houses. I mean, for many of the years in my astrological practice, I had lacked the necessary mathematical background to decide for myself which of the many house systems made sense to me. I could only read about the merits of this house system or that house system and take the word of those who supposedly knew. Eventually, I came to use the Campanus house system because some of those astrologers that I most respected, in particular Charles A. Jane, who was my closest friend in astrology, he used the system. And in recent years around that time, I'd been learning enough spherical trigonometry on my pocket calculator, this was before computers, so that I was able to make my first attempt at solving the mystery of house division for myself. Now, I've always been a slow learner, especially when it comes to mathematics, so I kind of had to sit down with an equatorial star map of the constellations and attempt to draw out graphically the various ways of dividing space and time, in the hopes of being enlightened as to which house system had the most going for it. Of course, I wanted to draw out the house systems using my own natal chart. I mean, most astrologers apply new techniques to themselves to see whether they get anything out of it. But doing this was kind of complex, for I had to calculate, using spherical trigonometry, the 360 degrees of my natal horizon. And I had to plot this curving line on a star map. All house systems agree on the validity of the local horizon. And so I felt that this was the place to start. And it proved to be a most worthwhile exercise. I soon became aware that regardless of which house system was used, what was of interest to most astrologers was not the entire 360 degrees of the horizon, but just those few places where it crossed or intersected with the familiar zodiac or ecliptic. Points like the ascendant and midheaven, for example. In other words, house systems in general seem to be concerned with different ways of sending meaningful lines to intersect the zodiac we love. And these interesting points of intersection are then like the cusps, or they're sensitive points, for any given individual. Kind of an astrologer's acupuncture points. Laying these different house systems out graphically, on a map, it helped a great deal to understand what in fact the various house systems were. But I still yearned for some simpler way to deal with it all. And finally, I reached a point where I just took the problem into my own hands and said, okay, Michael, let's suspend judgment on which of all these house systems is best for you and do something very simple, something that, although perhaps unsophisticated, would at least make sense to me. So I started off by making the center of my house system the place where one's born. And I put the pole of that system overhead, the pole of the birthplace. You know, it's a point in the sky that's called the zenith. Instead of using more complex methods of house division, I just divided the space surrounding my birth into a simple pie of 12 equal divisions, lines that were radiating out from the birthplace. These lines represented on Earth, geographically, and through space, astronomically, above and below. This, then, would be my very own house system. The points where the 12 radiating lines intersected the zodiac plane would be the house cusps, or the sensitive points, the nodes in this system. And at this point, I was no different from other astrologers who had developed their own house systems. I did find that although this method of house division was quite radical compared to the more familiar systems, the particular cusp degrees of the zodiac had already proved significant and were already favorite and previously noted points along my zodiac. I had, in my own way, stumbled upon what I found out later was known as the horizontal house system, which, along with the campana system, represents one of the two obvious and complementary ways of dividing the space surrounding a birth into equal parts. I named my version the radiant house system because it consisted of radiant lines from the birthplace, and I like the play on the word radiance. The astrologer L. Edward Jandro calls the campana system the Ferris wheel, and the radiant or horizontal system that I came up with, the merry-go-round. And astrologer Charles A. Jane has been pointing out the need to investigate this horizontal system of houses for many years. At that point, I was still interested in those 12 little points where the radiating house lines intersected the old familiar zodiac, the so-called house cusps. Then something very important began to occur to me. I began to see that the horizon itself was more than just 12 house cusps, which would be just 4 degrees in the whole 360. It was a complete circle in itself, just as the zodiac is, a circle that stretches a full 360 degrees around the heavens. Instead of considering the horizon as a necessary means to get at and to define these zodiac pressure points, the cusps, the house cusps, I began to follow with my eyes on the star map the line of my natal horizon, my radix horizon, through the heavens to the point where it intersected the plane or line of the zodiac on the same star map. And that point was, of course, my ascendant at about 8 degrees of Sagittarius. But as I did this, my eyes kept going past the ascendant. I kept going, and I followed my natal horizon until it intersected another line, that of the plane of our galaxy, at which point the first shock rolled in. It turned out that my horizon, my local horizon, intersected the galactic plane in the constellation of the Swan, Cygnus. So at this point I have to relate a somewhat more personal story to make clear what was happening here. Over the past years, I'd been assembling a book called Astrophysical Directions. It was one of the first books I ever published, and it contains stellar points and planes, and in that process I had to calculate and plot quite a few maps of the heavens. In this way I came to know and to develop a sense of all the major constellations in a much more intimate way than I had before. And throughout this work, I noticed, for some odd reason, a fixation on my part on a couple of constellations in particular. And above all, I had a special reverence, I don't know why, for the constellation Cygnus, the swan, and who knows why. On repeated occasions, for no reason I could determine, I felt such deep identification with this constellation and what it might signify to me that tears came to my eyes. I mean, go figure. Now I find that Cygnus was one of the two constellations where my own particular natal horizon, that 360-degree plane, crossed the great plane of the galaxy, kind of like the equivalent of a galactic descendant and ascendant. And the other one was the constellation Vela, the sails, also a constellation to which I've always been very sensitive. Well, at this point, I just had to laugh. And I said to myself, if the entire 360 degrees of the horizon, what if the whole horizon of my birth is as sensitive as the node where it crosses the zodiac, what you call the ascendant, which is all I knew about till then? Did I also have a galactic and supergalactic ascendant and new sets of constellations or signs to come to know? Now here I will shrink along into me, of course, beautiful story, and just say that this discovery was the first of a great many such mini enlightenments that I was going to have as my awareness grew beyond the limits of the traditional zodiac. Over the next few months, I traced myself through these star fields in some kind of personal odyssey and came to understand much more concerning my particular orientation or attitude toward the cosmos. And first and not least, that I had an attitude at all, that actually I had prejudices, I had things that I naturally liked there. And I searched through my collection of horoscopes to see how my friends and acquaintances, how were they oriented? In all of this, I was discovering the strength and power of the local horizon. I mean, I had previously accepted and used the ascendant, the midheaven, vertex, and other sensitive ecliptic, zodiac points in my work, but the accent was always on the zodiac, and it had never occurred to me that in each case, it took another plane to bring these nodes or points of intersection into existence. The zodiac by itself can do nothing. In this case, it was the plane of the local horizon. And yet I had, in a subconscious way, been using the horizon in all my work. And I could now see that each individual has a kind of unique orientation or attitude to the whole cosmos, and that in the horizon we have a power plane of power, capable of revealing much more about ourself, our life, than just those 12 sensitive points which we, the 12 house cusps, which we relate to the familiar zodiac. At any rate, I begin to explore the whole of the heavens from my personal, point of view. And for a time I forgot the zodiac, and instead I began to inquire into these other planes and came to learn a great deal that was new about my own attitude, my own orientation to my birth event, and to my life in general. Somewhere during this time, another idea occurred to me that proved to be most compelling. Of course, the horizon also traces a path on maps of the earth as well as the heavens. And I had calculated by this time a complete chart of the planet's position in the horizon system using that system's equivalent to zodiac longitude and latitude, which astronomers call azimuth and altitude. How, I wondered, would the directions of the planets in my horizon chart relate to directions and cities here on Earth? Suddenly a door opened. I soon developed the trigonometry needed to answer these questions. Quite a prodigious undertaking for me, because we had no computers. I was using log paper, pencil and paper and log tables, and thus began a real magical mystery tour through my life history. Now, although I have lived in several places in my life, one major move in my lifetime up to that point had been from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I was born, to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I grew up. And of course, what I wanted to know was, in what direction was Ann Arbor from Lancaster? That is, what degree and direction did Ann Arbor occupy on my natal or radix, birth horizon? And here rolled in what I can call the second great shock wave. Lo and behold, it turns out that Ann Arbor is right in the exact direction of my natal Jupiter position on the local space chart, within 2 degrees. So, in other words, my move to Ann Arbor was a move into the direction of my natal Jupiter. And Jupiter rules my ascendant, and its position just above the 7th house cusp has made it, pretty prominent in any analysis of my chart. So, of course, I wondered at such a coincidence, and I set out to answer some of the other questions that now begin popping up in my mind. Well, what about the other places that I lived, or places that I had traveled to, or that I had thought of traveling to? So gradually the history of my travel came before my mind. Some places of joy and learning, others of sorrow and pain. I plotted these directions, and I calculated the charts for all of these places. And what I found through reading these charts was overwhelming. It marked my initial surrender to what now appears to be, for me, in my life, a major discovery in at least my personal astrological life, and that's the astrology of local space. And I erected different local space charts, and these amounted to maps of the space surrounding each place as if I had been born there rather than in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The story of my life and self, as interpreted and confirmed through my reading of these local space charts, was, in a word, deeply moving. And let me cite just an example of the sort of thing that I found. I'm well known to my friends, at least, as being a homebody. It's very difficult for anything to induce me to leave home. Yet, at one point in my life, I sold everything I owned. My wife and I moved north to go into the green plant business, greenhouses, to manage our own greenhouses in a little tiny northern Michigan town called Everett. So I actually left Ann Arbor and moved away. As it so happened, we were a couple of years ahead of our time, in offering fine greenhouse plants to people. And the demand for these plants in the plant store craze did not appear until somewhat later in time. So we lost everything in this venture. On the material or investment plane, it was a complete disaster. Now, in my local space chart, I have a triple conjunction of the Moon, Uranus, and Saturn, and to the same degree, all bodies, all of those 3 bodies conjunct within less than half a degree. That's tight. I mean, in anybody's astrology, this would be accounted quite a strong focus. And the move into the greenhouse business was a move precisely to the degree into and toward this triple conjunction. So I had actually gone and moved into my Moon, Uranus, Saturn conjunction. It was as if we had gone there to wrestle, for me to wrestle and come to terms with my own Saturn, or Satan, whatever you might want to call it. And I did come out the wiser for it. For this experience, as hard as it was to go through, ended many more superficial fears on my part concerning loss. We lost what to us at the time was everything, and still our life went on. I could go on telling this story of my life as confirmed through local space charts, but I won't. Instead, I'm going to pass from a personal account to a summary of what I've found through research into local space charts since my initial discovery of them back in the early 70s. What had impressed me through this voyage of discovery was the potency of the entire horizon, as opposed to just a couple of its points, like the ascendant and vertex. And that somehow the orientation of an individual to the cosmos made a difference, or at least was somehow reflected in behavior. and in activity at the supramundane level. It took me quite a while to develop the faith, or to let myself believe that the spirit in us was so thorough in its influence as to be all-pervading, down to the finest details. Yet my first Dharma teacher, my first spiritual teacher, had some years before endlessly told me, and of course I didn't know what he was talking about exactly. He says things like, quote, "Michael, my God is no beggar. I don't have to make the ends meet. The ends already meet!" End quote. It was a while more before I could entertain with any kind of grace the idea that this same orientation, the same attitude, was reflected as much upon a map of the earth as upon the map of the heavens. And think about this. Another way of putting this, and this to me is the beauty of local space astrology, is that heaven and earth are interchangeable, or are, in the last analysis, one living entity, a single whole. Or as my teacher would say, this is it. With the local space chart, this was made ever so clear, because here was a chart where every object in the universe, celestial and mundane, had an equal and valid position. Not only the planets and the stars, but on an equal basis, cities, countries, and even the local water tower or your friends' houses can be represented. All that matters is the direction in space, the orientation, not the distance. In local space, the heavens and earth, the celestial and mundane or geographic spheres, these spheres exist side by side and are interchangeable. A star is a city, is a neighbor. We can walk toward, write letters to, or get up and travel into, for instance, our seventh house. And what is perhaps more important, we do this all the time. More startling yet, we can travel into our natal planets, since they also represent a direction on the globe in the chart of local space. So here, in a hopeless intermingling of the various planes of reference and of objects, a strange, and I must confess, somewhat magical view of our world begins to unfold and emerge, one in which every city and friend becomes a radiating center of influence. In this sphere, the long tradition of witchcraft and magic begins to become understandable. Here, local deities and preferred directions become the rule, and the world seems a tangle of significance. Certainly, the psychedelic character in local space charts is unmistakable, and it appears to be intrinsic to the system. The world appears as a kind of grand talisman or vast ritual ground, and the closest popular image of a similar nature in modern consciousness at that time for me was the remarkable world of Don Juan, as generated by the author Carlos Castaneda. So here is no subtle plane, this local space, but instead a personal landscape painted in bold and clear strokes and tailor-made to fit the psyche of each individual. Here is a world where the modern man is learning to move across the face of this earth in an endless dance of adjustment, of tuning his radix, his natal self. Individuals driven in particular directions on a checkerboard world, unable to resist traveling toward a goal there's no particular place on earth, so much as it is a direction imprinted within them, the direction of a force or of a planet. Quote, there where power hovers, end quote, to use Don Juan's expression. In a word, here is perhaps the most vulgar astrological system, where the obvious is enthroned and the subtle unnecessary. Now let me go over some of the basics again. So in simple terms, the local space chart is a map of the 360 degrees of the local horizon, surrounding an event, such as a birth, with the various planets' positions plotted on it. The map represents the full circle or plane of the horizon rather than only the 2 points at which it intersects the zodiac, the ascendant and descendant. The wheel of this chart then describes the horizon of a place, much as turning around on one spot. Panoramic picture, we might look toward the east, south, west, and north in full circle. In this horizon coordinate system, the fundamental plane to which all else is referred is the horizon of the observer, and the positions of the various planets as they appear from this location are projected onto the horizon using the coordinates azimuth and altitude. Azimuth is this system's equivalent of the zodiac longitude, and is measured for our purposes from the east direction through the north and on around in a counterclockwise direction. In the same way that we measure the traditional signs and houses. Altitude, which is analogous to ecliptic latitude, is measured above and below the horizon to the poles from 0 to 90 degrees, like any other pole. The single most important use of local space, at least in the astrologer-client relationship in my experience, has been in locality shifts, relocation. Where would be a good place for me to live? That's one of the more frequent questions that I get asked during reading. In the past, I've made use of the quite valid and very useful traditional techniques of adjusting the RAMC of the radix to the new locality and coming up with the new ascendant and so forth, the house cusps. The radix positions then are read in terms of these new angles. But local space is by nature suited to express both celestial and geographic positions on a single map or chart. Its special nature introduces several concepts that are not encountered in other techniques. So let's look at some of these. As I mentioned before, one can also plot the positions of cities and places on the Earth on the map of local space. So the next project would be to translate all of the important cities in our lives into equivalent positions on the radix local space chart. Directions. Which directions are they? And we should be sure to include not only the places that we ourselves have lived or visited, but also the cities that we've always thought we might like to visit, that bring a warm feeling to mind, and so forth. The positions of cities where friends and not-so-friendlies live, where there are business relationships, etc. These should be included. We then examine these places in terms of their positions or directions on the local space chart with the following thoughts in mind. Are these cities in aspect, in particular by conjunction or opposition? Are they in alignment with planets in the chart? In what quadrants and houses do these cities fall? And are any of them on the angles? I have found that individuals tend to move towards cities that are also in the direction of planets that represent the particular kind of energy that they may require at the time. An individual, for instance, that needs to invoke the key to success in their lives, that's often obtained through Jupiter. And they may make one or several moves in that direction. And although this concept is so simple as to almost be embarrassing, this technique has shown itself to be of great value. In any case, its value seems to be substantial rather than merely hypothetical. The local space chart can show a concrete, measurable relationship for the individual to any place, a relationship that can vary from individual to individual, even in the same locality, as much as their local space charts vary from one another. Now, whatever may be the intrinsic character of a place, and places undoubtedly have this, a selection of people could react very differently to it from the point of each one's own makeup. Moreover, each could react differently at different times, under different astrological directions, and coming to it from different places or geographical directions. And although the mathematics involved in this system may seem a bit complex, the application of its technique is simple, direct, and it has much to recommend it. After the basic information in the radix local space chart has been taken in, we may want to construct secondary charts for the various localities where the individual has lived or traveled. These charts are equivalent to ones cast for this locality at the time of birth, as if you were born there. And this involves a transformation of the radix positions and natal positions, as well as the more familiar shift around the angles of these positions. So planets like planets on an angle. Aside from the initial direction from the radix of the locality shift, there are other factors to note. Through a shift in locality, relocating, a planet or even a city may be brought into or away from the horizon or an angle. I have found that a planet achieves high focus when it's exactly on the horizon, zero latitude, or altitude, in terms of its activity within the individual. In other words, we can tune our natal chart and ourselves through locality shifts. And it's much like we would tune a musical instrument. This amounts to an adjustment in space rather than over time. Another objective that might be accomplished by a locality shift by relocating is to bring a yet farther away city to high focus. Say we bring it to an angle or an aspect to a planet, especially conjunction, which then allows a second locality shift to be made in its direction. This alters or modifies the psychic interaction of person and place by altering the direction of approach to it, how we approach it, how we come upon it. And the effect achieved would be quite other than that invoked by approaching it directly. Some of the magical quality of this local space dimension can be seen in the checkerboard-like world concept that emerges, where individuals not only move in relation to a planetary energy they require, but are ever adjusting and jockeying into position to achieve the most, what's the most resonant move. Apart from the focus achieved through the angles and planets, we also may compare aspects and even whole chart patterns with the radix local space chart, considering changes in orientation and so forth. Another point of interest, which has proven very useful in my work, is examining the aspects that the planetary positions in the local space locality shift make to the radix local space chart, in particular by bringing one planet to a conjunction with another by relocating it. As Charles A. Jane pointed out to me, this amounts to a progression of the chart through space rather than time, which is, if you think about it, it's a very elegant concept, especially for those of us who find it hard to wait. I found that both the conjunction and opposition, the alignments, as formed by this progression in space, are the most significant. So here I'll include an example of this progression in space idea to illustrate this elegant concept. In most methods of astrological progression or direction, a planet such as the Sun is moved through time to a conjunction, for example, at another planet's position in the radix, the natal chart. The Sun may be brought to a conjunction with Venus using any number of methods to progress or direct a natal chart. And this Venus-Sun conjunction will be precise or exact at some particular moment in time in the future. We may, for instance, look forward to our Venus-Sun conjunction, let's say in the 63rd year of life, and so on. However, using local space techniques, we may be able to achieve this same Venus-Sun conjunction by means of a locality shift that would bring the Sun to conjunct the local space radix for Venus in almost no time, just by going there. So perhaps modern man is developing an intuitive sense for self-adjustment and focus through locality shifts, relocation. This is something that ancient man did very little of, or maybe didn't have jet planes, had very little way to do it. And it appears that one can enrich and complement various qualities of the natal, the radix, through this kind of location adjustment. Bringing out needed energies at one place and time, and then moving elsewhere for another life episode at another place and time. These are some of the fundamental ideas with which I've worked so far. The obvious value of these charts, these local space charts, in the astrologer-client relationship should be clear. I have used these charts with great success and have found that many people are concerned with where they might live in order to bring their self into some resonant and satisfying focus.